Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I know we still have some folks rolling in. I am so excited about just the how many people have signed up for this event and all the interest and feedback we've gotten and all the amazing presenters. Thank you so much for joining. This is our third annual Impact Summit, moving beyond storytelling to measurable results. So I am happy to welcome you all today. My name is Melissa Musser. I am the partner and director of GRF's Risk and Advisory Services. And our Risk and Advisory Services comprise of, all things risks, enterprise risk management. We're really, really proud. I personally believe we are one of the best in enterprise risk management as it relates to nonprofit organizations. And I believe the same thing with this event here as well, because we are completely focused on this particular industry. We also offer, my team at least, cybersecurity, fraud and forensic, whistleblower, and all those wonderful things. I'm a CPA, certified information system auditor. I'm a CITP. I'm a certified internal auditor. We get into AI. I have a certificate in ESG. And the thing is everything is so interconnected. And ESG is too. And we've really found how it links to strategy and it links to enterprise risk management. And we want to really help connect all those dots for y'all today, but also connect those dots in your reporting and your storytelling as well. So sure you may know about GRF. If you don't, please check out our website. We used to be Gelman, Rosenberg, and Friedman. We've been around since the 1980s. We got our start servicing nonprofit organizations, and we've really been focused on that particular area, and we're also expanding, but we still keep our passion in the community, and we're very proud to continue to be independently owned. I don't know if y'all know some of the buzz, at least in the accounting world, with all the private equity buying folks up. We are proudly independent, and we're very happy about that. We are a traditional CPA firm with traditional audit and tax, but we also offer cybersecurity, enterprise risk management, like I said, and all the wonderful other things. But beyond that, if I can get the slide to change, maybe someone, okay. All right, but we really want to get into the meat of why we're here today. And it really kind of got started with, like I said before, enterprise risk management. And, ESG was really kind of on the rise before, and then there was a little dip down. But what we found is that, there's just this intersection with strategy. And if you know a little bit about kind of the background, I mean, ESG sustainability, I mean, it's been around for decades, right? I mean, I was doing sustainability type internal audits like 20 years ago. So it's really not new. But it's beautiful in the sense that, and I hear some folks refer to it as stakeholder capitalism. I don't really hear about that in these circles, but I think it's brilliant because it's like, you think about stockholder capitalism, right? Like, increase the earnings no matter what. But when we think about stakeholder capitalism, we want to increase value to our stakeholders no matter what, right? And obviously, there's going to be risks with that. You want to mitigate risks, but then it also influences your strategy. And people care about that. I know with GRF, we surveyed our employees at the last, we do, retreats and whatnot. And one of the things that mattered most to our employees was ESG related topics, diversity, recycling. So guess what? We implemented those things. And it's what I think is beautiful because it also mitigates the risk of talent shortages and different things like that. So very excited to help pull all this together for you. We have amazing presenters and they will introduce themselves when it's their turn to speak. But a little bit about what we'll be talking about today is just how to right size these different efforts. All these presenters have done these things, how to integrate those insights into enterprise risk management, how that stakeholder input that I was talking about can strengthen things, and how to measure and communicate those processes. Also, we have some awesome folks from GRF that you'll see, and they will also introduce themselves when it's their turn to speak, but feel free to reach out to myself or anyone on the team or even any of the presenters on LinkedIn. Wish we could shake your hand today, but I'm very happy to be with y'all, and I will turn it over to Alex.
All right. Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you all for joining us today. Very excited to see everybody rolling in. Got a lot of participants today. So before we jump in, I am going to do a little bit of housekeeping. But firstly, I'll introduce myself. My name is Alex McNeil. I'm part of the RAS, the Risk and Advisory Services team at GRF. I am an ERM and ESG advisor at the organization and very excited to jump into the session. So, just a few housekeeping issues. Please make sure you are muted. We have the chat, so please feel free to drop comments and questions in there. We'll try and address those as we go through the session today. The session will be recorded and shared with all of the participants that have signed up. Most PowerPoint presentations from the speakers will be shared as well. We will have polling questions as we go through the sessions today, mainly for the CPE credits. So for those of you that do need or are seeking CPE credits today, you must complete and submit a short survey that will appear automatically following the webinar. To obtain the CPE, please participate in each of the polling questions throughout the session, as that will show how we gauge your active participation. If you experience any issues with the polling questions, please respond via the chat functions so that we have documented your engagement. So also, please note that this webinar is not intended as financial or legal advice. This is simply for educational purposes. So with that, with all of the administration out of the way, I think we will now jump into the first polling question. So the first polling question is, how would you best describe your organization's current approach to ESG or sustainability? Please click on one of those options now. Don't feel like we're going to call on anyone to explain your answer. Feel free to just go ahead and click on where you think you're most aligned there. All right. While everybody is filling out those responses there, I don't see the results coming up just yet. I will start to shift towards our first session. So our first session is around double the insight, double the impact. So how to right size. Oh, here we go. Some survey results. So very mixed bag. Very hard to see kind of exactly where everybody is here, which is great. So we've got some with a very clearly defined strategy and actively implementing it. That's great. And yeah, a lot. Yeah, really spread across the spectrum. So please, as we go through the session today, it looks like there's a lot of different knowledge on these topics in the room. So please feel free to ask questions, jump in, say, please explain that more, or, others in the room, if you have experience in these topics, please feel free to jump in. This is a knowledge sharing session. So without further ado, I will jump on to the first session for today. So, what we're talking about here is double insight and double impact, how to right size double materiality to drive impact. I have the pleasure to introduce Tina Gunnison from FICA, which is previously Bridges to Prosperity and a former colleague of mine. Tina is a chartered civil engineer and leads sustainability and social inclusion at FICA with a focus on delivering people and planet positive outcomes. She brings over a decade of experience with the UK's largest contractor, working across major road, rail, building, and flood defence projects, including contributing to the UK's greenest road tender. Her work in East Africa, particularly building trail bridges with rural communities in Rwanda, reflects her commitment to practical, community-led solutions. Tina is also a trustee of Engineers Against Poverty and a council member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. I'll now hand it over to Tina to take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the lovely introduction and thank you for having me. Really excited to be kicking off a series of presentations today. So let's see if we can make this work. So like Alex said, I am the Sustainability and Social Inclusion Lead at FICA, and I'm going to share how we're using a double materiality assessment to shape our sustainability strategy at FICA. So taking something that is frequently considered a tick box exercise and using human factor to derive meaningful insights and value. And based on those poll responses, I was quite glad to see that hopefully there'll be some interesting takeaways for quite a few of you. So doubling the insight, doubling our impact, if you will, to shape our sustainability strategy. To give you a little bit of context, sustainability is something we inherently do in our organization. Fika constructs low emission pedestrian trail bridges, predominantly in East Africa. So we use local materials and donated cables from shipping ports that would otherwise go into landfill. And, we employ 20 to 40 people from that local community on each bridge build. So it makes economic, environmental, and social sense. In the last 25 years, we've connected 5 million people through constructing just hitting 800 bridges, like these you can see in the photo. So that's providing rurally isolated communities with safe year-round access to schools, markets, hospitals, and essential services. And that's in areas where crossings might otherwise look a little bit more like this. So it gets more complex because flooding is becoming increasingly severe and unpredictable, and it's directly affecting the livelihoods of rural communities, many of whom are subsistence farmers. And that climate inequality is tripled because those who have contributed the least to global emissions are the most vulnerable to the physical impacts of climate change, and they have the least funds for adaptation. So although we celebrate that 5 million people have been connected to date, there is still 1 billion people affected by poverty caused by rural isolation. And we realize that 25 years is not fast enough for us to solve this within our lifetime. So never mind ending poverty by 2030, as per the UN SDGs, that means that we need to scale. So in the next 5 years, we want to connect a total of 10 million people by going beyond bridges and into wider rural access. So doubling our impact in a fifth of the time. And how do you double the impact? With a double materiality assessment. So back when Alex, who you'll hear from a bit more after my presentation, back when he was COO at Fika, we were having early doors conversations over coffee about sustainability, how to go about it in a tangible way. It's really, really broad. So where do you begin? So a year ago, we set up a sustainability group that provided strategic steer. And at the end of last year, Alex messaged me and said GRF had just completed its own double materiality assessment. Perhaps that was something we'd be interested in. And so in January this year, I went from leading that volunteer strategic group to formally creating a sustainability department in Fika, team of one currently, to try put some structure around our culturally inherent sustainable ways of working, but to make sure that as we scale, we do that sustainably. So that's where we are now. We are partway through our double materiality assessment. It's been a learning journey that we're still going through, and I'm hoping to share some of those insights with you. So really, really briefly, if you aren't familiar, and I certainly wasn't, this is my understanding of double materiality. In its simplest form, it's a reporting framework. Many of you are already familiar with financial reporting, no doubt. So if you think of financial materiality as the planet's impact on an organization, then the double aspect of the double materiality comes from impact materiality, and that's capturing the organization's impact on the planet and the people. And for a purpose-led and mission-driven organization like Fika, that's much more appropriate. So that's where we hit the first challenge, or let's call it insight. And that's where there's so many different frameworks and many different acronyms, as you can see. So how do you know which ones to choose from? If you are a for-profit in the EU, then it's actually a little bit easier because since 2025, under CSRD, so Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, there are legal mandatory requirements. But Fika is US registered and we're a nonprofit. So for us, it's entirely voluntary. And this is where having Alex's experience and learning from GRF just came in incredibly helpful. So he helped us take these many, sometimes rather onerous framework and turn it into something that looked a little bit more digestible and understandable like this. So Alex really helped us narrow down and piece together the most relevant aspects from these different frameworks, so right sizing it for us. And it's a mix of global, US, and EU frameworks. And we selected the issues that were most relevant for our organization. And I think that's one of the big benefits of doing this voluntarily is that it gave us the freedom to tailor it to our needs. And it meant that we could spend time looking at the material issues that really mattered to us so that we could work out where we could have the biggest impact. So these are the 12 issues that after some back and forth, Alex and I decided were a good starting point for FICA. And based on key focus areas that we kind of pulled from our sustainability strategy group. So as you can see, there's a little bit from each of the different frameworks there. And we then took this list of 12 issues and we asked stakeholder groups to rank them by priority and importance. And I think this is the part where we truly gained value from this exercise. So I set out rather ambitiously wanting to speak with all of our stakeholders. And Alex reminded me that the community alone is 5 million people. So we had to be like a little bit more strategic with our selection. But what was really important for me was that all of voices were represented in one form or another. And that is everyone from community to funders to governments to employees. So in the interest of time and realism, we selected 15 individuals that would represent the voice of a different stakeholder group. So for instance, our regional impact manager, who has like incredible wisdom and experience working directly in the field for how many years, listening and capturing like thousands of community members. She spoke about the wider trends and concerns that she was hearing from these communities. I spoke with Rwanda, Uganda, and Zambia country directors to understand what priorities and concerns each of their respective governments have and are prioritizing. I spoke to our funders to understand why they fund us. And I think the most important key takeaway from our double materiality assessment was that as we were starting to formalize our strategy, it really helped me start the right conversations with the right people. And we actually had a really, really nice bit of feedback from some of our funders and corporate partners who had done their own internal assessments, but they approached it from a legal compliance perspective. So it was done by the risk function, no shade to the risk function, but they said that it lacked creativity, it lacked value, and they thought that we were approaching it in a much more meaningful way. So that's where I think the double insight comes in. It can be a tick box exercise or it can be a meaningful tool depending on how you approach it. So over the course of 15 separate interviews, I asked our stakeholders to talk about the general issues that were important to them without really focusing on sustainability, and then asked them to rank our bespoke list of 12 issues. And this is what we found. Now, this is still in draft. It might change. And it's going to be a lot more meaningful for me than it is for you. But I thought I'd point out a few insights that are hopefully a little bit more universal. So you can see that the issue that scored the highest on importance to our stakeholders, so that's on the y-axis or impact materiality, that was human rights. And the interviews verified this. Like there wasn't a single stakeholder who didn't rank human rights highly as one of the biggest impacts we have. And it's a reason that they keep working with us. But a really interesting insight came up like over and over again, and it was that the language wasn't quite right. So human rights has quite negative connotations, whereas if you look at East African governments' national strategies like Zambia Vision 2030 or Uganda's Vision 2040, the language is about improving standards of living. It's about turning Zambia or Uganda from a low income to a middle income economy. It's all about empowerment and quality of life. It's just a much more positive outlook. And we found this over and over. So it was a round peg in a square hole situation. Like despite our tailoring, this is a framework developed essentially for profits that we applied to nonprofit work. It was a framework developed by the Global North that we were applying to the Global South. And it's a framework developed to look internally that we're using to look externally. And so the language was one way that that became apparent. And on that note of language, when I was speaking to a really wide group of stakeholders, everyone had a slightly different understanding of sustainability. And there's already a lot of language out there, even just within sustainability itself, like ESG, the three pillars, triple bottom line. Um, and when you're talking across different cultures, geographies, languages, education levels, it just gets even more complicated. So as you can imagine, a community member would be a lot less worried about carbon emissions, to which they have contributed very little, and a lot more worried about the unpredictable floods that are flooding their fields or harming their family and friends or affecting their livelihood. But they're not using words like climate risk or climate resilience. They're talking about real impact that they face on a daily basis. So whilst framing these general discussions, I wanted to keep things simple, using language that everyone could understand and relate to that didn't require too much explanation. So I adapted the triple bottom line terminology and used people, planet, switching out profit for prosperity, and then adding in a fourth dimension, which is purpose. And I think that kind of helped everyone resonate a little bit because we're a purpose-driven organization. So as you've noticed in this presentation, I'm sure I'm using terminology quite interchangeably. In a second, you'll see that we back to ESG terminology in the reporting because that's what aligned with those standards that we were using. So second insight, taking a look at the x-axis now, by far the most important financial materiality issue was sustainable funding. And that is no surprise. Like it costs money to implement initiatives. But the double benefit is that if we have sustainable long-term funding, then so do our government partners. For the interviews, we've found out, to nobody's surprise, that one reason they keep working with us is that we bring those co-financing models. Funding is what is limiting most of the countries we operate in from catalyzing their development. Funding is also where we think there are big sustainability opportunities. So there's potential for us to unlock climate funding or green funds, and having this framework, which is globally recognized, could help us unlock some of that funding, as well as just really help us understand what actually matters. So shifting our focus into the lower corner now, this has made everyone who has seen this graph so far a bit nervous. Why on earth would employee health and safety and engagement and inclusion score so low? And it's not that these areas don't matter. So on the contrary, these are two of Fika's strongest areas. They are just so foundationally and deeply embedded into our culture that our stakeholders, internal and external, are just not worrying about these. And you can see that in this quote from one of our funders, that they've come to expect these as standard. You can also see that they're reacting to the language and that mismatch, saying that we improve health and safety and culture, not just across the entire, not just internally within our organization, but across our entire supply chain and the communities that we work with. So interestingly, because Alex and I had filtered out a lot of the non-relevant issues, this is the really high bar that we're starting from. And our stakeholders are expecting us to tackle all of these other issues that they're worried about and kind of bring them to the same level of stability and reassurance and high standards as these two social issues that are truly foundational for our ways of working. And for me, that was a real light bulb moment. I went into this exercise very focused on environmental issues. I treated it as a separate focus from social sustainability. And I wasn't too worried about it because it's just something that we do so incredibly well that I didn't think it needed additional attention. But what I've actually taken away is that that should form the very core of our sustainability strategy. Not carbon, not climate risk or emissions or whatever the rest of the world are already focused on. It should be focused around what makes us unique. And what makes us unique is that we're human-centric and we're people first. And that is just ingrained in how we work. So if I can figure out how to get all of these other sustainability issues as prioritized and embedded and natural in our day-to-day work as social sustainability, everything else will fall into place. So finally, I'll direct you to this cluster of 3 environmental factors right in the middle. This, I think, is how I justify having a job. So as you can see, lots of our stakeholders' attention is up in the top right corner. It's what they're thinking about. A lot of that stuff is stuff we're already working on. But this little cluster here in the middle, not so many people talked about in the interviews. And I think that's because despite all of our very careful stakeholder mapping, there is one big silent stakeholder that gets overlooked in almost all of these assessments, and that's nature. So if we start to advise beyond bridges on roads, drainage, transport networks, we need to make sure that biodiversity and habitats and the environment is thoughtfully represented in that. So that's where I'll be putting some attention on training and advocacy in the future, amongst other things. So the next steps for us are to finalize these results and then to use them to shape our sustainability strategy. And the double materiality is just one piece of that puzzle. We'll be combining our findings with our, I should say, 2026 to 2030 strategy, with our UN SDG mapping against our theory of change, and a couple of other inputs that you can see on the screen there to shape our sustainability strategy. So hopefully some of my insights about the benefits and limitations are valuable for some of you too, if you're considering doing a double materiality assessment or if you have already done one and it's coming up for renewal. And if you take nothing else away from this presentation, besides the cultural richness and beautiful landscapes of East Africa, it's these 3 things. So firstly, the double insight comes from turning it from a checkbox exercise into a meaningful tool. And I think that can poetically can be applied in quite some other areas of life as well. The double impact comes from having the right meaningful conversations with the right people. And then thirdly, build on strengths. And in our case, that's social sustainability. And as a sustainability department of one person, this process is helping me build in a little bit of sustainability into every single person's job that you can see on the screen here. And that is super apt because the theme of yesterday's Earth Day was our power, our planet. So it's all just about collective action. And if you want to go not just good practice, but truly lead the way in the sustainability landscape, then it's all about the triple materiality assessment. Because why settle for good when you can be great? So if the first dimension is financial, the second is environmental, so people and the planet, then the third dimension is context, so purpose. It's about putting the figures and the strategy into context, applying planetary boundaries and thresholds, and not reporting on figures in isolation. So that would be the next big step. And Alex has duly informed me that a double or triple materiality is not a once and done. So in 2 to 3 years, we go bigger. But for now, this has given us really, really great direction to double our impact and hopefully reach those 10 million people by 2030. And maybe in the next iteration, it can help us triple our impact. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tina. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you on this project and contribute a little grain of rice to the incredible goals that FICA has and are still very close to my heart. So Thank you very much. We will now move on to the next polling question. So, for this next polling question, what is the main reason your organization is engaging in or considering ESG or sustainability? Please go ahead and fill in your answer there. And in the meantime, while we wait for results, I just want to again recognize those incredible photos from that presentation too, Tina. Really, really beautiful landscapes and bridges too, of course. All right. As we wait for the poll results to come up, I will start to introduce the next topic for today, where I'm introducing myself and speaking and presenting on on this next topic. So, what we're starting to talk about now. Oh, here we go. Here are the poll results. So, what we're seeing here mainly a lot of you saying alignment with mission is coming in as the top. Interest from leadership and board at around 16%, and responding to external trends and expectations, and around 10 or so not currently focused on this. So, yeah, thank you for that. We will now jump into the next session where we are talking about integrating impact insights into enterprise risk management. So, what we're looking at here. So I guess I'll introduce myself again. So my name is Alex McNeil. I work within the risk and advisory services at GRF. To give a little bit more context than I gave earlier, my previous role was the Chief Operations Officer at FICA, previously Bridges to Prosperity. So my background is in the INGO sector, and have been now working with GRF on ERM and ESG advisory with the team. So, coming back to what we're talking about today, what we are really looking at here is, trying to drive value without reinventing the wheel. What we're looking at here is when we talk about impact and ESG. So, just to take a step back on ESG. So ESG and impact works, started largely around transparency, ESG in the formal sense of the word. Investors wanting to understand risks and impacts more clearly. So over time, this has grown into a set of standards and reporting frameworks. But today, for most organizations, this work is much bigger than reporting, and more organizations are doing this voluntarily because they see the value in it. What we're seeing is that it's not necessary. It's about understanding risks, impacts, and long-term resilience for the organization, for the communities they serve, and the environment that it depends on. To quickly define ES and G, the way that we view ES environment is how an organization affects and is affected by climate, natural resources, and environmental risks. Social is how an organization treats people, employees, communities, and partners, and how social issues influence their operations and outcomes. And on the governance side, it's how the organization is run, the accountability, the transparency, the decision-making, ethics, and risk oversight that the organization has in place. So in modern practice, ESG integrates both impact and risk, which is why it pairs naturally with frameworks like double materiality that Tina was mentioning, and enterprise risk management as well. So we've obviously, there's obviously been a lot of noise about ESG in the last 12 months. However, there is, positives coming out of this. And so, in fact, according to a July 2025 study by EcoVadis, 400 firms in the US, 87% are maintaining or increasing sustainability investment. However, what we're seeing is 31% are reducing the external messaging, a phenomenon that is kind of being termed greenhushing. So just to be clear, the specific terms might be used less, but the focus and interest and drive on ESG is definitely still there. And just a quick note before I go further, this presentation is not aimed at for-profit companies. We're aiming this at our client base, so nonprofits, INGOs, associations. So when I mention those clients, what are we hearing from our clients? So what we're seeing is that these ESG topics are increasingly becoming strategic risks, reputational drivers, stakeholder engagement opportunities. So how do you engage with your members? How are you engaging with communities, government, donors, employees, delivery partners? How are you capturing their insights and informing the way that you're driving your organization? Melissa mentioned this at the start of the presentation about how GRF engaged with the broader team about what was important to them and finding that ESG topics were really important. And so, can also be an employee attraction and retention differentiator. Employees think, does my employer walk the talk? And also driving funding considerations. Here we go. So a lot of those risks that I just mentioned is so before you all run away, I'll go back one slide. The key point here that we're looking at is, we're focusing on one method for centralizing and prioritizing these considerations, which is enterprise risk management, since there is a lot of overlap in the approach to ERM and ESG. However, please don't run away if you're starting to think, we don't have ERM, this is not relevant to me. The message we want to send here is one of ESG integration into existing business systems. Don't recreate the wheel. If you have ERM already, great. If you've been thinking about setting up an ERM function or reestablishing it, consider integrating that with ESG in mind. And if you don't have enterprise risk management, that's okay too, but consider how you can integrate and take a holistic ESG lens across your current risk management activities and strategy. And hopefully this session might give you a couple of ideas how to do that in a simple way. So what is enterprise risk management? At its core, ERM is pretty simple. It's about identifying what could affect your ability to meet your strategic objectives, prioritizing those issues, and using that insight to make better decisions. Most organizations, looks like I've gone back a couple of slides. There we go. Most organizations already do pieces of this through board discussions, strategy reviews, planning, and escalation. But where we often see the biggest gaps and what we often help clients with is connecting those dots, breaking down silos, prioritizing resources, and integrating decision-making. So ERM does this by providing effective governance, escalation pathways, and communication and monitoring tools to drive risk management and opportunities. So what you might be thinking is, why are we talking about ERM with ESG? ESG takes a similar approach. It's considering factors that influence strategy, shape risk exposures, and drive opportunities, and really driving that long-term value creation and engagement with your stakeholders. One of the biggest things we also talk about within ERM is breaking down silos, getting away from issues being owned and managed in isolation. So operations and HR, finance, technology and AI, legal and compliance, your programs. This is also extremely relevant for ESG. When organizations do ESG assessments, they're often mapping impacts, risks, and opportunities at the same time. They're looking at how the organization affects people and the environment, how issues like climate, workforce, or trust could affect the organization, and where they may no longer be where there may be no longer term opportunities tied to strategy or funding, kind of taking that longer term view. The key thing is here, these issues don't belong to just one team. They cut across operations, programs, finance, technology, which means they already touch strategy, decision-making, and stakeholder engagement. And that's exactly where ERM, or existing risk and planning processes, can help bring coherence to what would otherwise be something that stays fragmented. Okay. So organizations approach ESG assessments in different ways. There's a lot of ways to do this. So it can be done through double materiality, risk assessments, and stakeholder engagements. However, regardless of the method, they're all trying to answer a few core questions. What matters most, to whom, and over what time horizon? So this isn't necessarily about one right approach. It's about being intentional about the way you capture this information, but then also the way that you share it back with your stakeholders. One of the big questions is, once you gather all that information, this is something Tina touched on, once you have all of those insights, what do you do with it? How do you collect it all? How do you operationalize that information? How do you build it into your organizational DNA? And how do you engage with your stakeholders on these important topics? So this is where we often see ESG initiatives commonly break down. Organizations invest real time into these assessments. They gather good insights. However, those insights get lost in the noise. That's not because they're not valuable. It's usually because there's no clear place for them to live or influence decisions. And so this is the way we see it show up. We see duplication of effort, kind of that feeling that, sustainability efforts are already capturing topics that exist in risk registers, compliance reviews, or strategic planning processes. There's often fragmented ownership between different departments. Risks might be identified, but accountability for managing them is unclear or split across functions. There's limited decision impact. So findings inform reports or disclosures, but rarely shape capital allocation, risk appetite, or strategic priorities. And then finally, assessment fatigue. And I'm sure all of you are probably feeling this. So, there's often one assessment after another and looking across the organization. So, and these processes are often running in parallel. So this is what I like to kind of refer to as the overlooked overlap. So really, what we're looking at here is ERM and ESG are complementary to each other. A lot of the financially material ESG issues like climate risk, supply chain, workforce, regulation, reputation are already being discussed through risk and strategy conversations. This isn't necessarily new work. The topics are already influencing strategy, funding, and resilience, but they're often coming in through disparate channels. And these systemic risks and opportunities are often being missed because we don't have that centralized ability and governance structure to be able to identify, monitor, track, and essentially implement those. But there are probably systems in place for some of this already. So that's what I mean when I say, don't necessarily feel that this is too much for us to do. This is a whole nother department. No, what we really want to focus on is trying to integrate into existing business process. So when I talk about, so that these ERM and ESG are mutually beneficial to each other. On the risk side, traditional risk discussions tend to focus on near-term financial exposure. An ESG lens, or taking an ESG lens to this to the risk management, expands that, looking further out, considering dependency on external systems and bringing in stakeholder perspectives that are often underweighted. So some of those might be, bringing in those employee voices to say, what do we really care about within our organization? For those of you that work in associations or run events, that might be getting better insights from your members about what they care about, making sure that the events that you run are sustainable, that you are considering accessibility to those events, that you're considering the different types of suppliers that you are bringing on and their values are aligned with your organizational values as well. There's also, understanding what your donors care about and some of the risk management that goes along with engaging with those donors and explaining your risk profile to your donors, and as well, and often most importantly, the communities that you serve. So understanding their perspectives and what they care about can also be a really good lens into risk management. So, sorry. Okay, so what we now look at is, kind of seeing ERM as the backbone for ESG implementation. So ERM provides the infrastructure that ESG often lacks. So what we're talking about here is, a shared risk language for prioritization, and fair shared risk language is what we kind of refer to as a risk taxonomy. When you say something is a top risk, what does that mean? How much of a risk is that to the organization? And is that risk that the IT department is identifying, is that the same level as the operations or programs team is identifying, and really supporting that prioritization and resource allocation? It creates some of those governance and escalation pathways that are essential for accountability and really driving on those things and mitigating those topics and risks and opportunities that you identify. We're, directly linking to strategy and performance of the organization and taking a holistic view of the impacts, risks, and opportunities across the organization. So when ESG or insights are embedded into ERM, you get a new lens for strategy brainstorming. That's something that Tina and I have been discussing is a lot of the questions we've been asking through the double materiality assessment are questions that, maybe hadn't been asked in the past or being asked in a different way and getting really valuable insights from a different perspective and through a different lens. Financial and impact considerations are evaluated together rather than just looking from a financial perspective. You move away from parallel assessments, having ERM or risk management or risk assessments on one side and then ESG assessments on the other, to more of a broad, incorporated single risk universe or risk portfolio. And then, risk leaders can better see the trade-offs, independencies, and emerging risks across the entire organization. So to be clear, what I'm saying is, you don't necessarily have to have ERM. This principle still applies. Just think about how you can integrate ESG into the existing decisions and frameworks that you have as an organization. So what happens next? So going back to the risks that I discussed earlier, strategic, reputational, funding, workforce and your employees. The so what here is that those risks don't live in a report anymore if we can integrate it across the organization. They will flow into risk and decision conversations, and they will help clarify ownership, connect stakeholder priorities to resources, and avoid doing the same work twice. So what we're looking at here is really, if this is done well, this will reduce complexity and give you a single decision-ready view of risk and opportunity, a lighter lift with greater strategic payoff. Some of those trade-offs become clearer in terms of, decision-making. Alignment improves between strategy, risk, and stakeholders, and sustainability stops being a side initiative and becomes part of how the organization runs. So with that, our next speaker, Paul from Chesapeake Bay Foundation, is going to walk through what this looks like in practice, how this is being done within an amazing organization. So before that, we will jump to a polling question. Oh, and if there's any questions, please throw those into the chat. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn using that QR code there, and we will share out those slides and at the end of after the presentation today. So I see the next polling question is up, so please go ahead and throw your answers into that question. How does your organization currently collect and use stakeholder or member input to inform your priorities? Is it regularly collected, not so consistently used? Is it informal or ad hoc? I'm not currently collecting that stakeholder input. And while we wait for those results to come in, I will give a quick introduction to the topic itself. So Paul will be giving us a real world case study. Instead of just hearing from me about the theory, we're going to chat to Paul about how this was done at Chesapeake Bay Foundation. And here we go. Perfect timing. Here are the poll results. So pretty mixed bag here as well around how stakeholder inputs are being collected. So yeah, this is great. It's really nice to see a broad range here. So around 6 to 7 saying regularly collecting that input, and all the way through to informal ad hoc or not collecting at all. So I think there's some great discussions that could be had in this room. But on that topic, and without further ado, I will introduce Paul Smale. Paul is Vice President for Litigation and General Counsel at Chesapeake Bay Foundation, where he leads the litigation department, provides in-house counsel, and supports enterprise risk management as part of the executive management team. He oversees strategic litigation against polluters and non-compliant agencies under federal and state environmental laws. Prior to CBF, Paul worked in private practice and as an associate general counsel, focusing on corporate compliance, regulatory issues, and managing external litigation. For his legal career, he worked with state and federal agencies conducting ecosystem research at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory. So thank you very much for being here today, Paul. Very excited to welcome you to the summit. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Alex, and I appreciate that introduction. So I wanted to give an example of how GRF helped the Bay Foundation integrate both enterprise risk management and ESG. And I think how I've laid out the presentation is to give you a history of the foundation, how we approached our enterprise risk assessment, and then focus on one particular aspect of that assessment and a top risk that was identified. So the foundation was formed or organized in 1966, and it was a group of businessmen in Baltimore who, looked around and said, there's no kind of regional organization um, uh, with the purpose of cleaning up Chesapeake Bay. And the early days of the organization started, we were kind of spread out around downtown Annapolis. This church was part of the headquarters. You can see the cupola down the street, which was an old hook and ladder company, and we had offices there. So, and I think I being generous, I wouldn't call our approach to ESG and risk management ad hoc. I would rather describe it as organic, kind of as the organization matured. Uh, this was some photos of our early staff members from the late 60s and the 70s. Our first president, Arthur Sherwood, in the center. Will Baker is in the center of that photograph on the upper right, and he was our president for decades until 2022. And then you'll see on the left, in front of the one of our early education centers, some of the I would describe them as the founders of the organization, in education, science, advocacy, and that sort of thing. And keep these images in the back of your head as I proceed. Uh, Environmental education has always been a fundamental part of the foundation's mission, uh, cultivating and fostering the next generation of stewards was there at the beginning, and just as one aspect of managing risk, you know, we need to keep students and teachers and participants in the education program safe. And so, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but as Melissa and her team evaluated our policies, evaluated what risks faced the organization, the education program was mature and had a robust, uh, you know, essentially approach to risk. It was baked in for decades, and so, um, but again, when you see that's one of our captains, Lonnie Moore, who was there at the beginning in the center. We part of one of our he passed away just last year, and it kind of goes to the institutional knowledge that we lose, and also just again the length of history that the foundation has and how it's evolved over the decades. But that lack of institutional knowledge, or as it disappears or becomes unavailable for practical purposes as people retire, is also a risk we face. As the organization grew, we benefited from very generous donors, gifts of property. Uh, this photograph on the left is of the Karen Noonan Center in Lower Dorchester County in Maryland, and more than half of that county, if you're familiar with it, it's on the Chesapeake Bay, of course, is just maybe a few feet above sea level. It's a former gunning club, duck hunting club, and it was one of our and still is one of our premier education centers. The upper right-hand corner is Port Isabel, which is down near Tangier Island in the Virginia portion of the bay. And the lower right education center was Fox Island, which is in Tangier Sound. And I'll come back to that later. But again, this is kind of just an example of framing, our facilities that we have, and also as how the organization developed. So, and we continued to grow, and we added a restoration program, oyster restoration, wetlands restoration, riparian farmland, uh, uh, planting buffers and trees along streams, particularly in Pennsylvania. Um, Advocacy has always been a part of our mission as well. And as when Pennsylvania joined the Bay Agreement in the 80s, we opened up a Pennsylvania office in Harrisburg. That office celebrates 40 years uh, in existence this year. And so programs, the organization grew, I think, again, somewhat organically, but the mission has always been to restore the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And I'll talk more about that later as well, and how that vision has changed recently. But you can see that the communities we serve, those early founders, as I described them, that was kind of reflected how the movement was in the 70s. And that's not the case anymore. Um, and again, when I describe how we've grown, like many nonprofits, we've a lot of campaigns focus on particular issues, and whether it's oysters or planting trees or sometimes capital improvements. And in 2000, the Philip Merrill Environmental Center was opened, and this was a consolidation of our Maryland headquarters in one building, rather than being spread out around downtown Annapolis. And at the time, this was, I believe it was the first LEED Platinum building in the States, if not the world. Uh, and it was a hallmark. It was designed to be an example of green building, or environmental stewardship in terms of how we locate ourselves and how we represent ourselves to the world. This was a former Bay Ridge Inn site on the Chesapeake Bay, just kind of outside of Annapolis City. So this was previously developed land. Uh, the building uses a lot of recycled materials, um, you know, pickle barrels, certain, high resilience materials such as aluminum or galvanized aluminum siding. We have a green roof. We have solar panels that supplement our energy consumption on the roof. We recycle rainwater, and we used engineered timbers to build the center. And if anybody is in Annapolis, I'm happy to give or arrange a tour of the facility. It's still, 20, 25, 26 years later, it's still incredible to me. Um, but again, this was part of, we look at how we fit in the Bay Area, and how this is indicative of our approach to environmental stewardship. The next step was the Brock Environmental Center. And this was the first, this was part of a living building challenge, where we wanted to make a self-sustaining structure that, again, fits with the landscape, uses recycled or repurposed materials, can generate its own power, and essentially be off grid. And it was the first facility in the Commonwealth of Virginia where we actually could reuse rainwater, that we have a system. We were permitted, after an evaluation by the Health Department and Department of Environmental Quality in Virginia, to actually purify collected rainwater for human consumption. And again, consider these structures in the context of where they are. This one's in Virginia Beach, and these facilities are ultimately subject to potential inundation resulting from climate change. But again, that kind of brief history of where we were, we arrive at 2022 when Hillary Hart Falk was appointed our new president, and around that time or shortly thereafter, we started to reevaluate, you know, how do we approach these issues that have persisted for decades? How do we do? Are there things we need to do differently as an organization? Um, and we consulted with a diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice consultant. Um, how can we better serve the communities? Prior to that time, there's a movement called Green 2.0 within organizational nonprofits, where diversity is certainly an issue in the environmental realm, and some very often the organizations don't reflect the communities they serve. And I was appointed general counsel in 2023. What again, for some context, we've always had in-house staff attorneys that mostly work in policy. We've used outside counsel for various issues, for contracts, human resources, intellectual property, organizational litigation, but we never had a general counsel in all that time until 2023. We didn't have a litigation department until 2004, but before then we did use litigation as a tool to affect policy changes or to go after polluters. So in conjunction with the DEIJ work, Hillary and the board agreed that we need to undertake a strategic planning process. The world isn't the way it was in 1966. Are there things that we could be doing differently? Are there things that we could be doing better? Are there ways we can better serve our community? And that was an opportune time in 2024 to undertake our frankly our first ever enterprise risk assessment. And so we reached out to Melissa and her team, and retained GRF to perform that risk assessment. So things aligned. We were, and I believe in my opinion, this is the first time we've been deliberate as an organization in our history to incorporate, environment, social, and governance matters into the enterprise risk assessment framework or risk management framework. So just to describe, the top risks that were identified in the assessment were cyber attack and data breach, and appreciate Darren Hulum's work on that. Staffing retention, which gets back to the institutional knowledge and kind of in my mind, or in my words, kind of the founder mentality that persisted for so long at the Bay Foundation. Discontinued funding, whether that's from donors, from federal sources or otherwise, and climate change. Some of the other risks that were identified, political fatigue, public engagement, and partnerships. For however it's become, in the old days, in the Nixon administration, perhaps, clean water, natural resources were a bipartisan issue. It becomes more charged when fossil fuels are involved and that sort of thing, and also when people feel that their voices aren't being heard, or that their public officials or elected officials aren't hearing them, people run out of steam. And again, partnerships where CBF is often seen as kind of a regional powerhouse, and with that, you know, there's a limited funding network, and two smaller organizations feel muscled out by CBF. So we divided, or GRF divided, these risks into two different categories. And the first is where we develop or develop risk response plans and have begun implementing them. The second set of risks were addressed through the strategic plan. What I'd like to point out, or focus on right now for the rest of my time, is the climate change issue. Because again, reflecting back and looking back at policies and undertaking this process with GRF and the board, many of our the way we managed risks with governance and data security, those things were in place. The avoiding potential conflicts of interest with the board, having an investment policy that does not, or forbids investing in certain instruments like fossil fuels and things like that. But it wasn't until we developed that strategic plan that these approaches were incorporated in a deliberate fashion, in our impact on the community, how our board shows up, what stakeholders we answer to, in the same ways that Alex and Tina described it, looking at the communities, looking at our impact, looking at our partnerships. How do we approach advocacy with elected officials? And as a 501c3, we need to be, we cannot lobby or take a position on a candidate, or we can lobby in very restricted forms. And so it was, and I kind of I laugh sometimes because it's so fascinating to me, and having this work product that GRF produced, where we have a plan laid out. We have particular ownership of these risks. The departments take lead on these top 4 risks, and I think what I've tried to underscore to the organization and everyone I talk to is that every individual, every person who works there is accountable, um, and in ways owns the risk in their own right. And we try very hard to reframe, risk management not as this is what you can't do, but rather, this is what you can do, and empower people to take chances and know that just we're managing the risk and working through things. So climate change is a global issue. I'm not saying anything controversial in that respect. And I think that the owner, or the departmental owner of the climate change risk, is our advocacy and restoration department. And that is, it's both, they work on policy, they also work on restoration work, and how we approach agriculture, how we just, it's kind of it's the biggest department we have after, or it rivals education, but they deal with the thorny policy issues that we face. Of course, they rely on operations, which is fleet and facilities, and again consider these structures. Port Isabel, just like Karen Indian Center, is maybe a couple feet above sea level. We incorporated in both the Merrill Center and the Brock Center resilience to coastal flooding, and both structures are elevated. Uh, Fox Island was our first, climate casualty as a facility. It became unsustainable and unsafe to run education programs out there. And so, approximately 5 years ago, we made the difficult decision to dispose of that property. Uh, we've also, and just this morning before um, this presentation, this summit, I was reviewing a climate policy document that the Advocacy and Restoration Program had developed, and something that we currently wrestle with. Not, then this gets beyond just our facilities and our 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 fleets or our physical impact, or real property, I should say, is how do we advocate? How do we work in this framework? Say data centers or the energy that we consume. Uh, it's one thing in my mind to have these wonderful buildings that showcase what can be done, but how do we measure our impact on the community through we're using data centers right now. We're using that technology and cloud computing every day in all of our work. Um, how do we evaluate that? How do we evaluate our internal use of artificial intelligence to do our work? Because we have communities who say we don't want these data warehouses in our backyard. Um, uh, or we're concerned about the impacts from extractive water use, discharges of potentially contaminated or polluted water, conversion of forested land to large warehouse data centers. How do we feel? How do we as an organization show up if we oppose a certain data center, but then are using those facilities on our own? And so we're wrestling with that currently. So climate change and that risk goes beyond, the increased insurance costs or premiums and things like that. It goes beyond, you know, developing diesel electric boats, or education vessels, which would save us on diesel fuel. And so that's a financial benefit. And they also produce less particulate, less emissions, or particulate and oxides of nitrogen. So we're considering all these things. And before we had a strategic plan, before we had an enterprise risk assessment, these things wouldn't, in my mind, have been integrated. And I think that's where the magic happened, doing this all at once and having a uniform approach to it. We haven't had, we developed core values that reflect how we want to show up in the community. That we're connected to the people who live here and work here in the watershed, that we're credible, that we're use science-based decision making, not just being outraged about something here or there. Where we want to be courageous, we want to take risky positions. We want to be a watchdog for the community if there's a polluter who is impacting our members or just the community at large. And to that end, we also reevaluated our vision for decades. And it's not just the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, but kind of restoration in the Bay Area writ large was, this vision of Chesapeake Bay and tributaries as, when John Smith or the first Europeans came to the watershed or to the bay, Uh, and we based everything on that kind of, frankly, impossibility. Uh, and so we reevaluated, what does a saved bay look like? And to us, it's a healthy and resilient Chesapeake Bay ecosystem where people, plants, and animals thrive together. And that's a way where we try to balance um, economic growth impact or those kinds of drivers, and just people can have a healthy and resilient ecosystem, and climate change is going to affect that. Uh, and it's a tall order. And we're not doing it on our own. Um, I think that's really the end of my presentation. I know I kind of glossed over a lot of history, but I think that it's difficult for me to understate how important it was to integrate um, the enterprise risk management into our strategic planning process, because it does avoid duplication. It does everything that Alex described in his presentation. And as a general counsel, as somebody who has to give the board and leadership advice on what we do, I mean, it's a roadmap. It doesn't supplant professional judgment, of course, but we couldn't have done this without Melissa and GRF and Alex, and it's thrilling. So I think the next steps for us are um, benchmarking, checking out how we're doing, and perhaps looking further into our impact, and how we can take this to the next level as an organization. But thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Paul. Really appreciate that presentation, and love the work that Chesapeake Bay Foundation is doing on this topic, but also like how you kind of touch on those tensions of, we're an environmental organization, but how do we manage that internally as well around, the decisions we make on an everyday basis within the organization, not just externally too. I'm sure a lot of the organizations on this call maybe feel that way as well. We're going to take a quick break now, come back at 20 past the hour. There will be a polling question that pops up. We'll leave that up for the break. And if everyone could come back at 20 past, we'll hear from our next great speaker. Thank you all very much. See you in a few minutes. All right, welcome back, everyone. Gave you a couple extra minutes there. I hope you enjoyed the halftime show, and hope you got to answer some of those quiz questions. We've got our answers back now from the polling question around enterprise risk management. So good to see that a fairly larger portion of the group, over 50%, have some sort of ERM elements in place. So that's really great to see. We will quickly jump to polling question 5 before I introduce our next speaker. So what do you see as the main benefit of integrating ESG or sustainability efforts into your organization's activities? I will start to introduce our next speaker so that we can get started and make sure that we give her enough time and give her the floor. So I would like to introduce Krista Wright. She's the Executive Director at Polar Bears International. Krista has over 25 years of experience working with nonprofit organizations focused on environmental literacy and conservation. She brings deep experience in strategic planning, environmental education, and nonprofit leadership, with a strong track record of building partnerships across government, academia, and the private sector. She joined Polar Bears International in 2009 and has served as the executive director since 2013, helping shape the organization's strategy and growth. Krista is a passionate conservationist with a particular focus on the impacts of climate change on polar bears in the Arctic. So with that, Krista, I'd like to hand over to you, and thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all the attendees. I definitely want to give a special thanks to GRF for the invitation, and I guess we'll get started here. I wanted to start. I'm doing something a little bit different, and that's more not talking about our own ESG programs, but really talking about how we've been able to scale our outreach and impact through strategic partnerships as it relates to ESG. So we're going to start off with a little Polar Bear 101 and a little bit about our work. As Alex mentioned, my name is Krista Wright, and I'm the Executive Director for Polar Bears International. And Polar Bears International is a registered charitable organization, both in the United States and in Canada. And then most recently, we're working as through a fiscal sponsorship to also be working in the UK. And we're also working globally throughout our programs and the number of people that we're reaching. It's not just a North American-based audience. And so our mission is to inspire action to protect polar bears and their Arctic sea ice home through research, education, advocacy, and international collaboration. The pillars of our work, I just kind of mentioned that through our mission, but we are working internationally, and we also are a science-based organization that not only conducts our own research, but we also fund research through partnerships with governments and universities in order to really expand the impact of polar bear research. And then another big part of our work is education and outreach, because the greatest threat to polar bears is an impact of climate change on their Arctic sea ice home. And really, the way we're going to conserve polar bears is by engaging the global community in this global conservation issue. And then lastly, we work in the advocacy space. And that's really a growing part of our work, is really, we've always been advocates for conservation, but we're taking a deeper dive into the actual policy side of things as the organization evolves and grows. So our work spans the Arctic. For those, I wanted to do a little grounding about polar bears. There are 20 subpopulations of polar bears, and there are 5 countries that have polar bears, with 2/3 of the world's polar bears living in Canada. So our work really is around the circumpolar Arctic in the field. But then again, as I mentioned, it's really about engaging a global audience in the conservation threat to polar bears. We have two field locations. One is in Churchill, Manitoba. Churchill is considered the polar bear capital of the world. These are the two locations that you could, as someone who is interested in polar bears, actually go maybe see a wild polar bear. And so specifically, we've built and established ourselves in these locations because we know that people are engaged in polar bear conservation by the nature of them just visiting these places. So that's a big part of our field projects. And then I just want to take a few minutes to ground all of us in a little polar bear biology. So polar bears are highly adaptive to living in the Arctic. I mean, they are meant to live on the Arctic sea ice. And one of the questions we get the most is, well, without the sea ice, won't polar bears just adapt to life on land? Or could we build artificial ice floes where polar bears could live instead of actual Arctic sea ice? But I think a lot of times people don't understand that the Arctic sea ice is actually a habitat unto itself, and it's a habitat that's literally disappearing from the face of the planet. And so we need this ecosystem in order to support not only polar bears, but the entire Arctic biodiversity requires the Arctic sea ice. And not only do polar bears require the Arctic sea ice, I think probably most of you know that the Arctic sea ice is responsible for our global climate. So it's a stabilizer within our global climate, and so it's extremely important. And polar bears are just highly adaptive to be living out in this remote, frozen landscape. And this is just a few facts around polar bears. Um, as I mentioned, 60% of the polar bears live in Canada, so we definitely need Canada as a country to be engaged. We're losing 13% of Arctic sea ice a year. This is the equivalent of really all the Scandinavian countries over the last 3 decades, so you can see what a big impact that is. And polar bears were listed as an endangered species in 2008, and they were the first species listed due to a loss of habitat due to climate change. So the projections of polar bears is that we're going to lose 2/3 of the world's polar bears by 2050. And unfortunately, we are seeing that very much on track, and if not, slightly escalated. So basically, you have climate warming that leads to a loss of Arctic sea ice. A loss of Arctic sea ice means polar bears are spending more time on land. The more time they spend on land, the less food they're getting. They also have an increased expenditure in energy, which means calories, because during the time they're on land, they're essentially fasting because they need that Arctic sea ice platform to hunt their main prey, which is ring seals. And all of that leads to lower body condition. That lower body condition eventually leads to fewer and lighter cubs. Cub survival rate is less than 50%. And so through these threats, we're even seeing a greater risk to recruiting from the bottom of the population up. And that lower cub survival ultimately leads to a population decline. So now to get into things that are probably a little more relevant to this community, but I definitely thought it was worth a few minutes of just kind of grounding ourselves in our work and why environmental social responsibility leads to a lot to polar bear conservation. So specifically, Polar Bears International was kind of going back a little bit. We were founded in the 90s, but we didn't formally become an organization that had employees until 2010. And so a lot of our work has always been focused on identifying partnerships and collaborating with organizations and or businesses or governments that could really help us scale our work. We're a staff of 25 people now, but when I first started working at Polar Bears International, I was one of the first people that were actually paid to work at PBI. And so PBI always had this spirit of, how do we have the greatest impact and getting people to care about the threat to polar bears and engaging people in that conservation through this kind of partnerships. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our corporate partners. So specifically, we engage corporate partners to really help us reach our sustainability goals because our environmental impact is mostly through flights. I mean, we do not have big offices. We are not a big staff. And of course, we could look at our own ESG, but it's really through this ability to work with larger entities to help us reach our sustainability goals. We also know that by doing this work, we can engage a whole different audience. So by working with partners, we can engage customers, we can engage guests, we can engage schools, teachers, children in polar bear conservation. And specifically, when we work with corporate identities, we become a big part of engaging their staff, not just engaging their consumers or their customers or their guests, but also engaging their team to be as passionate about conservation as maybe the partner is. And then it helps us strengthen our brand. So, an organization that is small but mighty, we've looked at working with international brands in order to help us really scale what we're doing and help our brand be identified outside of maybe what our normal audience would be, which is usually people that are just super passionate about polar bears or super passionate about the Arctic. And really engage an audience that might not be ours. And then those people ultimately become part of the solution, right? They hopefully get inspired by what, if they're supporting a business or supporting a brand, that we hopefully engage them into the actual action of polar bear conservation. So one of the corporate partners I'd like to highlight, I'm having a hard time with things not advancing too fast. Sorry about that. One of the partnerships that I'd like to highlight is Canada Goose. So Canada Goose, we've been working with Canada Goose now for almost 20 years. So really, when we first had our first paid employees, we started working with a very well-known Canadian brand called Canada Goose. And at that time, they were really based in Canada, maybe a little bit in North America. But they weren't the big organization they are today. Today, they are it was a privately held company in 2008, and today they are a publicly held company that's not only working across North America, but they're working across Europe, Asia, and just growing by leaps and bounds. So we acknowledge that really governments have actually been quite slow to act, and specifically the US government has been on really addressing climate change and being the leader that we need to see in the world, and that businesses as well as communities play an equal, if not even a greater role in helping us engage people in climate action and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that has been a big part of our work with Canada Goose. They are also they have become a globally recognized luxury brand that is working in the space of manufacturing, retail. They have a corporate reputation, and all of that helps us promote our mission of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in order to conserve polar bears. They've helped us expand our audience, and not an audience that we would normally speak to. Often, a lot of polar bear lovers are probably not in the luxury apparel space. And so they've definitely helped us reach an audience that we would not normally be talking to. And then if you just look at fashion alone, the fashion industry contributes about 10% on average to annual greenhouse gas emissions. So they have a big role to play internationally in helping us achieve our goals. And specifically, luxury brands should be at the forefront of leading innovation. They often have, more resources to do so. And so through their innovation, they can create technologies over time that become, implemented in brands that might not be in that luxury brand space. So specifically with Canada Goose, I mean, you can read some of the examples here, but in our 20-year relationship with Canada Goose, and through the inspiration of working with Polar Bears International, they have really put ESG at the forefront of what they're doing and have become leaders not only in Canada, but internationally. The gentleman here who's pictured is Heider Ackerman, and I know most of you would not know who this is, but he is considered the next Karl Lagerfeld. He's Tom Ford's designer, and Canada Goose also brought him on. So this is someone who's working at the top end in the fashion and luxury business. And we've really been able to engage Heider in our mission as well. Again, helping us to really expand that audience and talk to a group of people that we normally would not be talking to. So, some of the things that we've done together with Canada Goose too have been, like I said, really like engaging that audience that normally we wouldn't have been talking to. They've done some really cool, innovative products where they're developing new technologies to use recycled materials in their in the products that they own, or the products that they're putting out to the consumer. And they also have a deep social responsibility of engaging Indigenous cultures, which is also extremely important to us from a social responsibility standpoint, in working with some of the most marginalized cultures in the world that have very little to do with greenhouse gas emissions, but they're seeing their environment change drastically. So the next example I wanted to give is our relationship with Frontiers North Adventures. They're a ecotourism company. They were the first certified B Corp in Canada working in the tourism space. So also leaders. Tourism also has a huge responsibility as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions, with an estimated 8 to 9% greenhouse gas emissions annually happening through tourism. That's primarily through transportation, through accommodations, food, and just overall consumer consumption. There's also a huge social impact that tourism can have in environments across the globe, and the Arctic is no different. Bringing people from all over the globe to places that might not have a lot of impact. And through that tourism, we see greater impact. So there's an opportunity there to engage in that social responsibility of tourism and how it can drive empowerment of culture, revitalization, and versus exploitation of culture and environment. And so they've been at the forefront of doing that. Last year, we actually embarked on developing an electric tender buggy. So you'll see in that picture is a tender buggy. That tender buggy we co-developed with Frontiers North Adventures and another organization called Noble Northern. And not only is this saving tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, but it's also demonstrating that you can make things that seem impossible, like having an electric vehicle run in the Arctic, actually work and get rid of kind of this demystifying that electric vehicles are not effective in cold environments and that they have limited use. Because this vehicle actually operates in negative 50-degree temperatures. And so that's been a big part of what we do with Frontiers North is this kind of working together to increase impact. And specifically, when people come to the Arctic, we already know that they have a vested interest in what we're doing. They're coming to see polar bears in the wild. Obviously, they're interested. They care about the Arctic. We know that. And so we can engage that already enthusiastic audience. But there's also a lot of people who will never get to come to the Arctic to see polar bears in the wild. And so one of the things that the buggy does is actually reaches over almost 9 million people a year. We do live broadcasting from the buggy. We talk to schools all over the world. We've partnered with big entities such as Discovery Education, with Google, with Apple, so we can reach literally millions of people all over the world. And the relationship with Frontiers North helps us do that and really inspire people to act and protect polar bears. And these are things, of course, that an organization like Polar Bears International could not do on their own. So again, this idea of kind of scaling impact through effective collaborations is so important. And we're really proud of our relationship with Frontiers North. This year, we'll be entering our 25th anniversary with them. And we really have this like missions aligned relationship where we help each other be successful. And so the last example I wanted to give, and there's some good examples of people on the call today working at similar and like-minded institutions, but that's working with zoos and aquariums throughout the world. So we have a network called the Arctic Ambassador Center Network. And those are zoos and aquariums that are spread across North America and Europe. And zoos and aquariums, this is a fact that I know most of you won't know, and it was something that I was really amazed by when I first started working with Polar Bears International. But zoos and aquariums, and this could include, I think we have people here from natural history museums and other kind of environmental education centers, but they reach over 2 million people annually. And there are over 254 accredited associations through the Association of Zoos and Aquariums that facilitate and meet high standards, not only in animal welfare, but also conservation. They do a tremendous amount of education to their audiences, and they actually reach more than all sporting events combined. So it's a huge audience. They play a significant role in engaging ESG into their missions and their criteria. And they are considered conservation experts and community educators and also leaders in sustainable business practices in some of the largest cities in the world. So zoos and aquariums have the ability to, be, even though they're educational institutions, they're also businesses. So they can demonstrate how a business can be a leader in ESG. From an environmental standpoint, they implement a lot of green practices and responsible sourcing. They've been leaders in LEED certified building and other green practices, demonstrating that, and not only demonstrating, but using those buildings as learning centers and talking about sustainability. They have a huge social responsibility in that they work with children and teachers from all demographics, educating people, all over the world about cultures, all over the world as they connect those cultures to animals as well. And then governance is a huge part because they have very robust accreditation standards and a lot of scientific accountability. They are considered trusted sources in science that's been vetted and tested. So when people go to zoos and if they feel and/or aquariums or natural history museums, when they get information from those public spaces, people really believe what they hear. So they are institutions of knowledge and that are believed by people that are visiting those institutions. Specifically, some of our work working with zoos and aquariums includes we have a climate alliance program where we bring some of their staff to the Arctic, specifically to Churchill, Manitoba, and we engage their staff in a year-long training program to really focus not so much on polar bears, but more climate change messaging, because that messaging can be used across species, not just polar bears, because climate change is not, it's impacting a lot of the world's species. And so we've worked on training not only people that are in the education and conservation space, but also the communications and marketing teams and how these teams can work together to really promote climate literacy. And again, be reaching these 200 million visitors a year and engaging them in climate action. So that's one of the areas that we work with our AAC centers. We've also engaged in a lot of research collaboration because there's a lot of things that we want to know about polar bears that we'll never learn from a polar bear in the wild. So an example of that is we were looking at really putting in or doing research that might protect places where polar bears where polar bears are living in their habitat really close to industry. But in order to do that, we needed to understand what polar bears could hear, because a lot of that industry can then lead to disturbance and specifically to moms and cubs when they're in their den. But we were never going to learn what a polar bear could hear, the range and distance that they could hear, the frequencies that they could hear. So we partnered with some of our leading zoo and aquarium partners to lead a hearing study on polar bears, which we did, which was amazing. We worked with San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance and SeaWorld in order to conduct those studies.
I think we may have lost Krista there. Paul, can you confirm that you can't hear her anymore as well?
Yeah, I can confirm. I can't hear her currently.
Okay. All right. Well, I think Krista had one slide left. We might just kick on with the summit and we will hand over to the next presentation. And if Krista jumps back on, we'll hopefully give her a chance to close that out during the panel. But next up, we've got a polling question. This next polling question is, what is the biggest challenge your organization is facing as it relates to ESG and sustainability efforts? So while that's there, I just wanted to, again, thank Krista for the amazing presentation. I really like that approach to, Krista, you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that. I just dropped off, I realized I was talking to myself. But
No
hopefully that
problem.
was really, I think I got in most of what I wanted to cover. And just really kind of reiterating that the spirit of collaboration and how it can help small organizations just have a much greater impact.
Great. Thank you so much. And that was kind of what I was going to touch on as well. Polar Bears International as an organization of 25 has such outsized impact through those incredible partnerships and partnerships with maybe, you know, uh, non-traditional, reaching outside that, area of traditional stakeholders to really engage different actors to address the climate challenge as well. So thank you so much for the presentation. I would now like to move on to the next presentation that we have. I'd like to introduce Paul Lochner from our team, who is our facilities manager and greenhouse gas inventory lead. He guides GRF's internal efforts and our clients through emissions reduction goals. He identifies opportunities for reducing organizations' impact on the environment and leveraging these efforts for strategic advantage, funding, and employee engagement. So I'll hand over to you, Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Lochner. I'm glad that everyone's here. We'll try to push through this in a very concise manner. Um, I'm joined today by Professor Thomas Sterner. He's a professor of environmental economics at the University of Gothenburg. Um, so I wanted to make sure I had a quick note on how this will work. I'm going to be the I'm going to bring the practitioner perspective, and Thomas will bring the research and policy lens to the conversation. So the first item that I wanted to talk about was the mindset and decision use that people have. So I just wanted to throw out and ask, how many of you have actually started an inventory and wondered about, how do you actually get the numbers? And that's exactly what we want to discuss today. So Thomas, I wanted to start with a question. For organizations that are just starting, how many organizations, well, many of them take a phased approach when starting. And with this approach, where does the pragmatism help with this approach? And where does it risk becoming a permanent comfort zone?
Well, look, organizations like municipalities or federal agencies or big companies, they're truly immense, and it's complex, and so figuring out just how to take one trivial example that is still quite common and relevant, how to make sure that the lights are turned off in the night is actually very difficult. Sounds simple, but isn't. And the sort of it's very important to engage as many as possible in the organization, and to do that, I think that this kind of tool is one of the best tools. And I think you have to start simple and to get people engaged gradually.
I see. So we're talking about basically developing a roadmap, knowing, not trying to gather everything at once, but gathering the important components first. What's
Yeah,
material to your business
yeah.
or your association or nonprofit?
The
Um,
important ones and of course the ones that you can most easily affect and measure yourself.
yes, yes. And that's actually a wonderful segue into the next topic I really wanted to discuss before we go any further. I want to give everyone a practical grounding in how these numbers are actually built. So, as you all may know, there's scope one, which is facilities and items such as a fleet of vehicles that you own directly. There's scope two, which are energy that you purchase and don't own directly, such as you would get electrical bill would be an example of that from Pepco. And then scope three are your indirect costs, all the value, the complete value chain of items that you don't actually have any control over directly, but you generate, um, you generate a carbon footprint by having your value chain. So what I really wanted to discuss was just, how do we actually do the calculations? What are we talking about? And so the first, component I really wanted to make people or make sure everyone understood is you have really everything breaks down to one basic formula, and that is your activity data times your emissions factors, which will give you a CTO equivalent, which is really what you're looking at. So that is everything in greenhouse gas accounting, and everything comes back to that equation. For example, for direct emissions, as I said, that would be an example would be national natural gas bills for something that you actually own. What you would do for that is you would convert them to therms or cubic feet. You would convert that to a something called MMBTU. That's the In order to do that, you multiply, your gas bills or the amount of gas that you actually have by an emissions factor. Or you could, if you have a fleet of vehicles, you pull all your fleet fuel records and you use that to determine your total gallons that you've consumed. Um, Moving on to scope two, which are things that you purchase from other suppliers that you don't actually own directly, such as, combustion, your electrical bill or your heating bill or steam. Um, that would be electrical invoices, which you use like a regional e-grid factor. Basically, there's a U.S. grid region that EPA publishes that provides emissions factors. The other interesting component is your organization can use RECs, which are, or trying to Thomas, what is the name for my brain is stopping me for a moment here. What does that stand for?
Uh, which one?
Um,
Rex?
yes, yes. Oh, carbon
Um,
credit.
yeah, carbon credits,
Yes,
right. Yeah.
sorry. My brain was stopping. It was
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
tip of my tongue. But you can use that to reduce your scope 2 number. But the important thing is when you're using it, you need to make sure that you're not using it in the place of actually the actual work of reducing it. But it is an accounting item that you can use and purchase. Scope 3 again is the value chain. It's spending. Usually, well, it's spend based. There are two ways of really going about getting a good scope 3 as a starting point. That would be the items that are material to your business, or you can import expenses, categorize them into categories. And what the importance of that is it gives you, in the end of the day, it gives you lets you identify the biggest buckets of potential savings or things that you can optimize. So one practical pointer is please don't let don't let the enemy uh, don't let you don't have to be perfect in your calculations. You just need to have a good starting point. So don't let perfection be the enemy of starting. That's really all I wanted to say regarding scope one, two, and three, and sort of the calculations. I'm not trying to make anyone, or I'm not trying to make anyone an expert in it, but that's hopefully gives you a good grounding. Um, so, Thomas, I wanted to ask really another question for simplification and credibility when you're doing calculations. Many organizations rely on simplified tools or estimates, especially for indirect emissions. What guardrails are essential for keeping simplification from undermining the credibility?
Well, I think it depends on your organization, right? So the detail you go into must be in proportion to what kind of organization. I was thinking while you were talking, I was thinking of Volvo, which is a trademark that is well known. everywhere, but it's actually has its home in the town where I am living, so not far from here. They actually do uh, look at scope one, scope two, and scope three, and they have large teams of people who calculate these things. Scope three is the biggest, and that is the emissions from the cars that they produce. And they're very intent on reducing not only scope one, which is like, housekeeping and the facility, but also scope three. And scope three, they address that by producing more electric cars and successively basically producing only electric cars in the relatively close future. But if you look at a smaller organization, you have sort of a Greenpeace office here or something in Gothenburg. They obviously can't work with that kind of level of detail, and they must do something that is commensurate and appropriate for a small organization, which might be the electricity bill and if they have a car or something. I mean that it will be much smaller. So I think this needs to be depend on the case you're looking at.
Mm. For organizations that operate in the US primarily but have international clients, how should they see or be thinking about this divide that you just discussed between Europe and the United States?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting divide, and if I mean now I haven't lived in the States for a decade, but I read, and it seems that ESG and DEI and so on are under quite a lot of attack. And I get the impression that industry has wholeheartedly dropped their interest in some sectors, or some industries have. It's interesting to see that this hasn't happened quite so much in Europe. And I know, for instance, that Volvo is, as a big car company here, it's intent on electrifying. They have made their decisions, and they're not going back on that, and they get rather upset with the European Union when they want to slow down the rhythm of even Europe is also going ahead, although at a somewhat slower pace than they originally anticipated. And now Volvo is mad at them for slowing down the transition, because basically be a disadvantage for Volvo since they have already committed to go ahead.
I see. So things are still moving forward in the larger world.
Yeah, well, I know Sweden's not the larger world, but
Well,
but in Sweden they are, and in large parts of Europe. I'd say Europe is still, of course, divided, um, but in most of Europe they are still progressing.
hmm. I wanted to ask you if you had to name one thing that organizations should never compromise on when building emissions data, regardless of their size or sector, what would it be?
Oh, that's a tricky question, but one thing that comes to mind, I just wrote a paper. The European Union has the largest cap and trade scheme in the world, called the EU ETS. It is a cap and trade scheme for carbon credits for the whole of European industry, and not only industry but some other sectors as well. And I wrote we were a team of authors that I had handpicked, and we wrote a happy birthday article because the EU ETS is now 20 years old. And so we wrote a review article of the last 20 years. And one of the co-authors was Jos Delbeke, who has been the Director General in the European Commission for climate, and he actually was in charge of the EU. So he told us a lot of inside stories. And he
Mhm.
singled out, he said that the one most important thing that happened early on was actually creating a correct inventory of carbon emissions. He said that was completely crucial, and that they thought, which I also thought, they thought that, well, the countries already had that. But it turned out that they had a lot of garbage that was not
Mhm.
correct. And you can't really build a trading scheme if you don't have proper data on every single facility.
True.
You know.
True, true. But I get that idea or that kind of feeds into the idea of, particularly for an association or company, um, you're not trying to provide all the data, but you're trying to provide, you know, um, data that's material to your actual operations through scope one, scope two, and scope three. And by doing that, you again, you're not trying to, get all the data at one swoop. You're trying to get a nice baseline, and then later you can add and refine the data and make it and optimize, find, optimizations in your operations to to make it profitable for you, to actually be doing the greenhouse calculations and the various policies and governance and whatnot. So that does feed into that idea of making sure you don't have garbage in, garbage out,
Yeah,
but
that's
being upfront
perfect.
with what you have.
Yeah, it's perfect. I mean, the one nuance there is that if emissions are regulated, traded or taxed or something, then you do need to have everything and it needs to be exactly right. But that applies to scope one emissions. Um, Scope three emissions is virtually impossible to have. You're a car company, you don't know how your cars will be used and how far they will be driven. You don't have that responsibility. That scope three numbers will always be more indicative, and they are not traded or regulated in the same way. So I think we need to think of these, understand that scope one, two, and three are a bit different.
Mm, I understand. I see. Well, I just looked at the time. It looks like I do appreciate you joining us today, Thomas, for this conversation. I
It
just
was
looked
very
at the
interesting.
time. I did look at the time, and I think we need to move on to the polling questions. So now we have polling questions. Polling question number 7. So this is, how is your organization currently approaching greenhouse gas emissions or environmental impact? Please let us know. Are you measuring actively? Are you starting to measure or explore the area? Are you considering it? Or are you unsure? We'd love to know what the poll says. Let's see. Well, it looks like oh, okay. So it looks like many are not currently focused on this area, which is understandable. Hopefully you've gotten that, you can get some operational efficiencies out of this. Um, we are excited to see that many of you are actively managing your emissions, and that's a wonderful start, and we're very excited about that. I believe now I need to introduce the next topic that's coming up and the next speaker. I'd like to introduce Umid. He will introduce um, the next topic is developing meaningful metrics and reporting frameworks and communicating progress effectively. Um, I'd like to introduce Umid. Umid is our senior manager with GRF's audit and assurance, and he'll be joined by Adam Bloom. Adam is a graphic design and communications manager at GRF.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Good
Thank you.
afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. It's great to be with you this afternoon. We're going to talk about the power of impact reports. We're going to talk about developing meaningful metrics and reporting frameworks, and then communicating progress effectively. We're going to start off with some brief introductions. I'm going to introduce myself first. Omid Mohebi, CPA. I'm a senior manager at GRF CPAs and Advisors. I've been with the firm since 2011, and I've been part of the team that has been developing the external ESG consulting practice and import impact report practice. I'm going to move on to Taryn Tuss. Taryn, over to you.
Hi, I'm Taryn Thus. I am the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Communications at Green Seal, which is a nonprofit standard development and certification organization. Over to Adam.
Hi, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Adam Bloom. graphic design and communications manager at GRF. So beyond the firm-related projects that I work on material for clients like reports and presentations, really to make them understandable and hopefully visually compelling and attractive. And I've also worked in the international development space, mostly around reporting and communicating results of monitoring, evaluation, and learning.
Thank you, Taryn and Adam. I should also add that Taryn's organization, Green Seal, are an audit client of ours, and they have been for a very long time. So we love working with them. They are a great organization. Okay, let's start off by just talking about, in general terms, how an impact report can benefit your organization. Essentially, it's a very powerful tool to tell the story of your organization, everything from your people to your policies and procedures to your different stakeholders. And stakeholders can be both internal and external. We'll talk about those a little later on. But it's essentially a very powerful way to present a clear and compelling picture of your operations, your policies, your achievements, and your future aspirations and goals. But in addition to that, it's not just a pretty document with some beautiful photos and a few charts and some statistics. It's an effective tool to manage risks within your organizations, both risks which are in place currently, which exist currently, and also risks that you foresee in the future. In addition to that, it's an effective and powerful tool to engage your stakeholders, whether those stakeholders be your employees, your leadership, your governance, or whether they're the communities in which you interact with, the vendors that you deal with on a daily basis. So it's a very powerful tool for stakeholder engagement. Operational efficiency. It's a way, in the process of putting your impact report together, and once you have it in place, it's a very powerful tool to determine what are the opportunities to increase efficiency within your organization. Where are those gaps? How can they be filled? And what are the improvements that you can make? And very importantly, it's also a powerful tool for talent acquisition and talent retention. A lot of the items and areas that you cover in your impact reports are going to be matters which your existing employees and potential employees care about. So again, they are stakeholders. It's a way of determining what are the things that matter to these stakeholders, how do we communicate those matters, and how do we make sure that we tell this story to the fullest extent so we really say everything that's positive about our organization. And one other thing is that it protects against greenwashing. And many of you know what greenwashing is. Some of you would have heard of it, but not really sure. Greenwashing is essentially when an organization is accused of using deceptive means and deceptive language of making claims about their sustainability, environmental policies, and track record, and so on. So if you have an impact report which is backed up by solid facts, solid statistics, then you're protecting yourself about accusations of greenwashing because it's all there for everyone to see. Okay. Now, let me just start off by saying that when we talk about what goes into an impact report, there is no one size fits all. So it's never possible to just come up with a list of items and say, this is what an impact report includes from A to Z. Every organization is different. And even organizations that are similar in terms of their operations will have different priorities with respect to their stakeholders. They will have different priorities in terms of what they want to communicate to their employees or to their vendors or to their communities. So certainly, I just want to make sure that there is no one size exhaustive list that fits every single organization. However, there are some areas which we typically see in impact reports, and not all of them in every report, but these are sort of some of the key areas that we see. First and foremost, we see an overview of risks. And we talked about the fact that an impact report is a very powerful risk management tool. And again, the organizations will determine what the risks are, and they will sometimes include those in their impact report and actually address the measures they are taking to manage those risks and address those risks. Why? Because that gives their stakeholders comfort to say, A, this organization knows about what risks they are facing now and in the future, and B, it's obviously that they're in control. They know how to, they've addressed measures to mitigate these risks, to address these risks, and therefore that gives those stakeholders additional comfort about dealing with your organization. And even from employees will feel additional confidence in the direction of the organization. Another thing that's typically included in impact reports are policies and procedures with respect to ethical conduct, conflicts of interest, responsible engagement. Again, not just saying, in your vision statement or your mission statement or some fancy taglines or and buzzwords to say, oh, we like to be ethical and so on, but actually referring to the policies and procedures that you have in place and showing the stakeholders that we do have these policies, we do have these procedures, and everyone is expected to adhere to them. The next bullet point also is very related. Governance practices. What are the expectations of leadership? What are the expectations of the board of directors? How much transparency in there? Are they also required to abide by the code of ethics and have integrity at all times and sort of avoid any conflict of interest? Again, this adds to the fabric of the impact report. Many impact reports, depending on the organization, focus mainly on issues of sustainability. What are your recycling policies? What sort of energy efficiency policies and practices do you have? Do you have a LEED certified building? What other energy efficiency practices do you have? Are you taking any measures and do you have any policies relating to reducing your greenhouse gas emissions? Do you have any activities with respect to carbon offsets? And what other sustainability practices do you have? Again, a lot of people and a lot of stakeholders care about these things. So this is an opportunity for the organization to really address these in the impact report. And there are many, many other additional topics. Again, we're not going to go for every single item, but the impact report can refer to cybersecurity practices. We've talked about conflict of interest and ethical conduct policies. AI, a very large and very sort of popular speaking topic right now. Again, we're seeing a lot of organizations address the risk with respect to their employees using AI. What are the policies that they have to prevent anyone doing anything using AI, which would possibly damage the reputation of the organization? What are the work culture and employee wellness programs you have? What are the benefits that you provide to your employees to make sure that they have a good work-life balance and good healthcare and so on? All of these things matter. And so on, pay equity. What are the awards and achievements that you have received in the past, and what are the goals and aspirations that you have for the future? Going back to this whole sort of key aspect of telling a story of your organization. We talked a lot about stakeholders, right? So let's just delve in a little deeper about who those stakeholders are. Where internally, it's pretty easy. Internally, your stakeholders are your employees, your leadership. I guess your board of governors, your board of directors can also be regarded as internal stakeholders because they're part of the organization. Externally, depending on the organization, you may have investors, you may have regulators, grantors. You may have communities that you are engaged in with respect to voluntary service and other means, customers, vendors, and so on. So again, all of those are an organization's stakeholders. And then the next step will be which of those stakeholders are most important to you as an organization? And what are the concerns that those key stakeholders have? And how do you best address those concerns and communicate to those stakeholders regarding their concerns as part of your impact report? So step one, identifying stakeholders. Step two, which are the key stakeholders? Of course, your employees are always going to be right at the top of the list. If you don't keep your employees happy, you might as well close off shop and lock the door. So again, step two, identifying who those key stakeholders are and means of communication. And then you tailor your impact report in a way that communicates those priorities to their stakeholders to drive maximum engagement. So it's a very exciting process. And as part of actually developing the impact report, we really find out much, much more about who you are as an organization, what matters to you, and where you want to go in the future. And the process of developing an impact report. Well, in many ways, just in the same vein that there is, excuse me, there isn't an exhaustive list of what goes into an impact report. There also isn't any sort of a one size fits all process of developing an impact report. However, as we said, the main point will be the starting point will be who are your stakeholders? How do you want to engage with them? What are the items and issues and areas that you want to communicate to them? a big part of the development of the impact report will be you have to collect and analyze hard data and metrics, quality data, quality metrics. You can't just wing it. You can't just talk in very generalized terms. If you're going to have an effective impact report, if you're going to protect yourself against greenwashing and so on, you've really got to collect and invest time and effort into collecting that data, analyzing that data, and making it meaningful. One of our speakers referred to earlier regarding a double materiality assessment. So many organizations choose to perform a double materiality assessment as part of their impact report, where they look at both financial and non-financial impacts, both from within the organization outwardly and outwardly coming back towards the organization. So essentially, you're going to end up with a clear, data-driven story of your organization, both at present and for the future. And you're going to look at both qualitative and quantitative matters and aspects. And I'm very pleased to say that here at GRF CPAs, we have a great team with deep expertise at developing impact reports with beautiful tables and graphics that Adam is part of the team. And so if there's anything that we can help you with, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Taryn. Taryn, over to you.
Great, thank you. So hi everyone, great to be speaking with you today, and happy belated Earth Day to all who celebrate. For those who might not be familiar, as I mentioned before, Green Seal is a nonprofit that develops science-based sustainability standards, and we certify everyday products to those standards. So that's everything from cleaning products to hand soap to sanitary paper. We're especially big in the commercial and institutional products market, so you can find us on products in, airports, hotels, office buildings, schools. We're pretty dominant in that space. So we like to say that sustainability is everyone's business, and I think that's increasingly true. There's a growing expectation that organizations don't just talk about sustainability, but demonstrate it clearly and credibly. Impact reports are one of the best tools we have to do this if they are done well. So what I want to talk about today is how to make those reports meaningful. First, though, I will quickly share a bit about the lens Green Seal brings to this. So we're a third-party certifier, which means that we verify products that meet a defined and rigorous standard. And that work is used by governments, institutions, and global brands who all need confidence that what they are specifying or purchasing is delivering the impacts that they expect. So in practice, the companies we work with often point to our standard criteria to substantiate their claims. And on the other side, purchasers and large organizations and institutions often require specified Green Seal certified products because they can have confidence that they will meet their needs. So we sit in a unique position. We're between manufacturers who are trying to make credible sustainability claims and the buyers who are trying to make better decisions. And all of this is in a landscape where expectations and scrutiny are increasing. We know that these days regulators, NGOs, consumers, and investors are scrutinizing everything from packaging labels to websites to executive statements, and yes, impact reports too. So one thing we see over and over again is that credibility stems from defensibility. And that perspective really shapes how we think about all claims, whether they're on a product label or in an impact report. The growing scrutiny of sustainability claims is often framed as pressure, but really it's a sign of progress because it means that sustainability is being taken seriously. The challenge is that without a strong foundation for sustainability claims, organizations can fall into one of two traps: greenwashing, as Omid talked about, or green hushing. So greenwashing happens when claims move faster than reality, and green hushing happens when organizations avoid communicating real progress because they're afraid of scrutiny in a complex regulatory environment, which is understandable. But research shows that silence doesn't solve the problem. When you take a look at the broader landscape, nearly 2/3 of consumers say that they are very or extremely concerned about environmental sustainability. And yet, consumer protection authorities from 70 countries have found that 40% of green claims made online can be considered misleading. And surveys here in the US have found that most Americans, more than 50%, doubt companies that claim to be environmentally friendly. This phenomenon means that there's real opportunity for organizations that can communicate their impacts clearly and credibly. So what does that look like? At Green Seal, we often say that a solid claim is specific, qualified, and substantiated. So this means staying away from terms that are vague or broad, like eco-friendly or natural. I mean, asbestos is technically natural, but that doesn't mean you want it in your home. These kinds of claims they're currently actually unregulated, but the FTC Green Guides does caution that we should stay away from unqualified general environmental benefit claims because, I'm quoting them, it's highly unlikely that marketers can substantiate all reasonable interpretations of these claims. And we do see a lot of action out there when folks are trying to use these claims. So you do want to stay away from them. You want your impact report claims to be specific. What changed, by how much, and over what period of time? Specificity reduces interpretation, and that's important because interpretation is where the risk tends to come in. An impact report should also be transparent about any assumptions or limitations used when you're developing your metrics. So what's included, what's not, and why. Being transparent about limitations actually builds more trust, not less. And substantiation is another important piece. This is where standards and third-party verification can be pretty helpful because it's the difference between saying, well, we believe this is better, and showing that it meets an independently defined benchmark. So it shifts credibility from internal to external, which can help you out. And next is consistency. When organizations change their metrics from year to year, it becomes very difficult to track genuine progress. So consistency is what turns reporting into accountability over time. And finally, I didn't put it on the screen, but it's in the session title, and it's arguably the most important one. Your claims should be meaningful. So to use a product example, a cardboard company could legitimately claim that they increased the recycled content in their products by 50%. But would you be impressed if that meant they went from 2% to 3% recycled content? Okay, I think I know the answer. You know where the greatest potential for impact lies in your company, and your report should address that. So when all of these elements are in place, you move from claims to proof to trust, and that's really the goal of impact reporting. We released Green Seal's 2026 impact report yesterday, actually, on Earth Day, as we do every year. And so here you can see a snapshot of some of our metrics. Really, they're the aggregated impacts of our customers who produce certified products. These numbers are real and they're meaningful, but they're not the starting point. The starting point is the system that we set up behind them. So our model is standards, certification, market adoption, and then impact. We define what leadership looks like through our standards, and then we verify that products meet that bar through certification. Those products are then adopted across institutions and markets, and that is what generates measurable outcomes at scale. So when we talk about things like millions of people protected from harmful chemicals or millions of tons of emissions avoided, they're tied directly to verified criteria, the criteria in our standards. Metrics is just one section of our impact report. So because of the nature of our work, our report is less about disclosure and more about lifting up leaders and inspiring action. So there is plenty of narrative and storytelling as well. Because while claims build credibility, stories build connection, and the most effective sustainability communication does both of those things. I'll close with a few practical takeaways. So what works consistently is clarity and discipline. Quantify impact clearly because ambiguity creates confusion. Be transparent about how you measured it, even at a high level. Anchor your claims in credible systems or standards so you don't have to carry that burden alone. And connect the data to real-world outcomes so it actually means something to your audience. On the flip side, what tends to weaken reports is vague language, claims that outpace evidence, changing metrics over time, or avoiding nuance. So overall, When the system behind your work is credible, the story becomes much simpler and trust follows. Okay, so thank you very much. Hope that was useful. I will go ahead and turn it over to Adam.
Great, thanks. So others have done a great job discussing the concepts and their own examples of building an ESG and impact analysis and reporting. And so I wanted to talk more about the nuts and bolts of putting a report together, especially for organizations starting out. Now, for those who are starting or are early in their ESG and impact reporting, you don't need to think of each item and topic that I'm discussing as a fully formed must-have from the start, but considerations for you to develop over time as your reporting matures and you start to see these trends and news stories emerge. So to start with, a good practice in creating your main narrative and storytelling is incorporating a bottom line upfront approach. So you can ensure that the key information is delivered to your audience, whether they read through the entire report or just skim through. The idea here is putting the top findings of ESG analysis, program impacts, related trends in your organization or space, and next steps for your organization right at the beginning. This can be done this can be something like an executive summary, an infographic, or similar brief overview, and then elaborating throughout the rest of the report. You'll want to talk about ESG and program impacts in an audience-friendly way with less jargon than you might have in an annual or board report. And you can think of the narrative as both the actual paragraphs of text that weaves the report together, or just the overall structure of the report and how sections and subsections relate and flow into one another. Now, I mentioned less jargon. Sometimes you can't help it. You can't avoid it. There's no getting around double materiality, for example. Now here, stories, explainers, quotes, and other types of content helps ground your narrative and makes your report more digestible and memorable. Stories are what audiences ultimately remember. Research shows that 5% of surveyed individuals remember statistics, while 63% remember a story. Overall, the narrative of the report and storytelling within should align with your organization's mission, values, and strategy. When it comes to impact, both ESG related and programmatic, data is key, but representing it with clear visuals can be challenging. So here, let's look at a before and after. On the left, we're showing data, and on the right, we're telling a story about the data to provide more context and more actionable insight. With better storytelling in this example, a decision point is clear to stakeholders that an organization can maybe potentially focus on what's working with individual donors, or maybe they focus on corporate donations like they had pre-pandemic. In terms of the content of what you show, focus on data that reveals impact, not just activity. This data should call back to your organization's mission and vision. An impact report is an opportunity to distinguish your brand through creative direction. This can especially be true for smaller or mid-sized organizations without fully built out brand and identity standards. You want to create a unified design to strengthen recognition of your organization's brand and align your typography, your colors, your photographic style with the overall brand. Now with accessibility, when building your report, you don't consider accessibility or consider accessibility and don't look at it as an option. Color blindness is often used as an example in accessible design discussions. Accessibility could broaden the reach of reports and other material and improves audience experience since 8% of the population is colorblind. But then consider other types of disabilities or impairments, and it can really be a significant part of your audience that benefits from accessible design. Reports should be readable by all audiences as much as possible and compliant with accessibility standards. This includes what's visible, like colors in a chart, as well as the behind the scenes report structure so screen readers can properly read through the document. That's usually in the code of a PDF or a website. And the result is better for everyone. Curb cuts, another example where accessibility made improvements for more than just those with disabilities. They were designed for wheelchair users, but they also benefit bikers, parents with strollers, and pedestrians. Now for us, accessibility improves legibility and clarity of your content for everybody. And it also increases trust between your organization and your audience since everyone can feel included. Now with photography, photos bring to life reports and add visual interest. We see some great photos today. photos can humanize and add authenticity to ESG and program impacts for audiences. And so I won't really belabor the point that photos are important. But given the nature of the nonprofit world, we also want to be careful about consent when including people in them. Do no harm was a concept that I learned in the international development space, and I adapt it here where you don't want to cause harm while trying to help. So gather informed consent from photo subjects to avoid them being potentially unwilling poster children for your causes. And if you use stock photography, choose carefully since a lot of the styles and even the models that they use have become repetitive and cliche, and that can work against your brand. And so distribution and format might feel like a little bit of an afterthought. We'll get to it later, but it's very much a design decision and one that you'll want to make early. Your main options are usually a PDF, a microsite, or even something printed, each with trade-offs around cost, reach, and accessibility. There's no single right answer, but the key principle is decide early so you can design once and distribute intentionally. If you know you'll be pulling social graphics and donor one pages from this report, you can build those assets in parallel rather than scrambling after the fact. And on the rollout of your report, you don't want to post a PDF and call it done. A single impact report can fuel months of communications. A data call out becomes a social post. A case study becomes a donor pitch. A pull quote becomes an email header. And so treat it as a campaign, not a check the box exercise, and you'll get far more mileage out of the work that you've put in. And so with that, Taryn, just real quick, I just wanted to throw it back to you and get your thoughts, see if anything stuck out as far as best practices go based on your experiences of putting a report together.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say agree with everything you said.
Great.
But yeah, and also, I think you do really want to consider the format you're delivering your report in and think about multiple formats. We have a microsite at Green Seal, and this makes it just really incredibly useful, easy to distribute, and really widely used by our stakeholders. It's just a quick hyperlink. It's not a download, and it's not a 20-page report. It's a pretty quick scroll. So you can have multiple versions of your impact report tailored to your different audiences, and really get, as much mileage out of it as you can.
Perfect. Adam, can we move on to the polling question now? Or is there one more slide?
Guess just if anyone has questions or has anything to discuss with us, then please feel free.
Thank you. Thank you, Taryn. Thank you, Adam. It was wonderful to do this particular session with you. So much expertise and so much content. So thank you both for that. Now we're going to move on to a polling question. How do you currently communicate with your stakeholders about your impact, sustainability, and ESG efforts? So if you take a moment to select your answer, that'll be great. Thank you. Okay, we'll wait for the results. Which should pop up any moment. Okay, interesting. So the majority, we're not currently communicating in a structured way. So, there's always a place to start with. So that's fine. And we have some formal reports around 17%, and informally on an ad hoc basis 13%. So pretty even there, but the majority are not communicating in a structured way. But as I said, this hopefully this particular summit will give you some momentum to start and put some structure and formality together. Okay, thank you everyone for that. Now we're going to move on to our next session, which is our panel discussion, practical tools and real world examples. We're running about 10 minutes behind, so we'll see if we can wrap up our panel discussion about 20, 25 minutes. We're going to welcome back Tina, Paul, Krista, and Thomas. Now, we spent today talking about frameworks and, excuse me, I lost my screen here. We're talking about frameworks, risk integration, and practical tools To close, we want to shift gears and make this very real. So this panel is about what works for organizations focused, what they simplified, how sustainability, climate, and impact information are being used to run their organizations better and not just to report them. We'll keep this very practical, example driven, and focus on lessons learned. So I'm going to move on to the first question. I will just sort of act as a facilitator for the conversation. The first panel question will be on right-sizing efforts without losing impact. And this is going to be mainly focused and addressed to Tina and Paul, but of course, additional perspective from Krista. So Tina and Paul, how do you decide what really mattered for your organization and what were the hardest things to intentionally leave out or simplify? Tina, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much. I think I talked a lot in my presentation about how we decided what mattered, and the double materiality assessment really helped us identify what mattered. So we didn't really decide or need to decide. We just had to look quite rationally at the map and look at what it was telling us. But in essence, that process is asking questions and then listening to the answers. So that's essentially how we decided. Maybe more interesting, the hardest things to simplify. I think there's like three discrete things. Like really on in the process, me and Alex were really mindful of keeping our own personal biases out, which is what can happen when you're right sizing, right? So Alex has this risk angle, I have an environmental angle, and so it was almost a little bit sad, but it was a relief to see that, environmental didn't come out on top because it meant that I had kept my personal biases out of the interview process. And I guess the second thought around hardest thing to simplify is that we are treating, or the way we have gone about it is choosing to treat all of our stakeholders and all of their voices as equal. But they're clearly not. So like we weighted our results against the risk register, but does the voice of our CEO hold the same weight as that one person who's representing 5 million people? And then, of course, I obviously wanted to speak directly to the stakeholders. So that was another tricky thing for us to simplify.
Thank you, Tina. And Paul, any insights from you?
I think it's quite similar on a smaller scale. I think as we look at what we've done in the past and how we've grown, it is a matter of right sizing our staff levels. It's through the strategic planning process. I mentioned during my presentation that restoration is a large component of our work, but we can't restore our way to a clean bay. We can demonstrate projects, we can demonstrate how regenerative agriculture works or repairing buffers and how they could be implemented or even oyster restoration, but we can't do it on the scale that say, Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay can do, that's their primary purpose. Also, how looking at how we show up with the community, there can be tension between donor interests and those of folks in the community. And so how do we reconcile that while remaining credible? So it required some introspection, but I think we're in a good space. And just as an example, in kind of a regulatory or advocacy front, we kind of pulled back from engaging on every federal action that comes down the line, and seeing how we can tell our story or our community's story on a more precise basis. As we engage on federal rulemakings or perhaps the repeal of the endangerment finding, which is currently going on right now. How do we tell our story? How do we make that resonate and add value to the work we do?
Thank you. And I'm going to address the next question mainly to Krista. Krista, let's talk about strategy, mission, and donor impact. How has addressing specific ESG issues changed the way your organization thinks about strategy, or changed how funders and supporters understand or engage with your mission?
Yeah, we've really focused, I'm really honed our focus on, really filtering everything through our mission and then integrated that strategy so there was mutual alignment in our partners, right? Like, so if our partners didn't have a similar mission or similar goals in mind or commitment to ESG, we, chose not to work with those entities and to make things less transactional and more impactful. So it wasn't just about, maybe how much money we could raise, but also all of these other things that could come from partnerships, from, like scaling our audience, using their commitment to ESG to, help move our mission forward. And really this kind of like a co-creation to the partnerships, whether that was with corporate partners or donors outside of just like kind of one and done initiatives.
Thank you, Krista. And I think the next question I'll also start with you, Krista, which is where has stakeholder or member input meaningfully changed your direction, or have you changed their direction?
Well, yeah, we've definitely had a few donors change our direction in a good way. I mean, one of those, I'll give an example. To do polar bear conservation, for instance, in Alaska, you're working closely with oil and gas industry. There's just no way to avoid that. Like, where they're doing work is directly related, I mean, and right next to polar bear habitat, and we actually needed their support maybe to do some of our research. But of course, we had donors that were very skeptical that we would be working in a partnership with like ConocoPhillips or BP, and so a lot of that came through education. It wasn't that we were taking money from oil and gas, but we actually needed to work with oil and gas in order to be in these places doing research, because they were the ones like housing us. They were the ones getting us to and from places, in places where there's no other infrastructure other than that. So that's a good example of where, you draw the line on like maybe not taking funding from those organizations because the backlash from donors, but also realizing that they are stakeholders in polar bear conservation and that we need to be able to work with them. And, there's some examples where, they put in like a ice road and a pipeline, and then a polar bear popped its head out of its den, where we were the first people they called to say, can you help us? Because shutting down their operations was going to cost them millions of dollars, and we could actually help them by advising them in how they could control their operations so it wouldn't impact that specific bear, but yet they could continue doing their work. So I think yeah, I mean, that's a good example, I think. And then really looking at, helping getting our donors like actually engaged in our policy work. And because it isn't just about them supporting our work financially, but how can they support our work from like an action standpoint? And through that, then you have much deeper engagement with all of your partners, because you move from this transactional aspect of finding support from your work to them actually helping you do your work outside of funding streams.
That's fascinating what you mentioned about the oil companies and your organization working together, because I think the perception that many people have is that you're completely at odds with and have very sort of exclusive interests in the Arctic, and you're probably sort of fighting with each other. But it's nice to see that there is a sort of partnership between the two sides in terms of everyone achieving their objectives and sort of nature living with in harmony with sort of industry and the oil industry.
Yeah, it's a fine line. It was fine to get their help, but not take their money. And that's a very clear line from the donors and also from the organization as well. But that doesn't mean you can't be working together and finding different ways in which to collaborate to move an initiative forward.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll move on to our last question regarding impact reporting, communication, and storytelling. And I'll start with Tina on this. How do you translate, Tina? How do you translate impact, sustainability, or climate work into stories and communications that resonate with your stakeholders? We talked a lot about that during the impact report session. How do you do that so that it resonates with stakeholders rather than overwhelming them or confusing them with data?
Um, so I think I hopefully demonstrated that in my presentation through we're very visual heavy and we have like some truly amazing storytellers within our organization that um, don't so much tell the stories, but they just create a platform to let the communities we work with tell their stories directly. And I can share one example of that in the chat, which is a video we've recently put out that is just connecting with people on a
Yes.
human and on an emotional level. And then the flip side of that is that interestingly, we actually have a big data gap in the geographies we work in. So we're doing a lot to try to actually gather our own data,
Mhm.
monitoring like we just did an RCT randomized control trial with 10,000 communities to actually get hold of that data and then put it, in the hands of the governments to back our claims and avoid some of those pitfalls that were discussed in that last panel session.
It's very fascinating what you mentioned about just connecting on a human level with just photos and video and so on. Of course, you want to back it up with facts, but just especially on the videos, just people seeing on a video that sort of what is being done and the impact that you're making, that's extremely powerful. And Paul, what about with your organization? How do you translate impact? How do you do the storytelling and effectively communicate your impact?
It's quite similar. We're very fortunate to have a marketing and communications department and have our storytellers there. But I think it's the same sort of thing that the visual storytelling is much more powerful. I can give just two examples. We were engaged with some partners to stop a hydroelectric project going in on some farmland in York County, which would be adjacent to, I think, three other hydroelectric projects on the lower Susquehanna River. It would displace families and farmers and uh, kind of inundate some conserved land up there. And a board member approached me, and I was featured on just this little video on our website. And she said, talking about it and hearing you describe what's at stake makes it real for me. And we've had similar situations like that. And sometimes my job is to make things real for a judge or for a panel of judges. And so that storytelling comes across in very different fashions. But again, how do we make this real? How do we can talk about tons of nitrogen or phosphorus or sediment, but what again is the human impact on our communities?
Amazing insights. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just to avoid running out of time, I'm going to wrap up the session there. I'm going to hand it over back to my colleague, Alex. Alex, over to you.
Thank you, Omid, and thank you to all of the panelists. Incredible insights there. Really appreciate you kind of bringing us back to this practical approach to how to integrate ESG and sustainability and impact issues across your organizations. I believe we have one last polling question of the day. It should pop up here in just a second. So which of the following best reflects your organization's next step related to sustainability, impact, or ESG? Hopefully we've maybe helped inform, or some of our speakers have helped inform, some next steps here. and some great ideas from the organizations that we've worked with and heard from today. Really incredible the work that they're all doing, and so excited to have such amazing clients and partners with GRF. All right. So while those polling results are coming in, I will start to close out the day. So thank you again to everybody. Tina, Paul, Krista, Thomas, Taryn, Adam, Amid, Paul. Thank you all for joining and sharing your expertise, and just as importantly, your practical real world perspectives. Each of you help translate what can sometimes feel abstract into real choices, trade-offs, and organizational realities. I also want to thank the GRF team for shaping today's conversations and keeping everything running smoothly behind the scenes. And thank you to all of you who joined us, all of our attendees, for the thoughtful responses to our polling questions. And if you have any more questions that you'd like to send through, please feel free. So what we set out to do with this summit was very intentional. This wasn't about frameworks for the sake of frameworks or adding more to already full plates. It was about trying to create space for practical conversation around sustainability and impact, talking about how these show up as risks, opportunities, stakeholder expectations, and strategic considerations, and how organizations can address them without overcomplicating the work and drive towards, tackling these really tough challenges and essential issues of our time. So across today's sessions, a few of the themes consistently stood out for me. So, the importance of prioritization and right sizing, using existing processes and governance rather than in reinventing the wheel, integrating sustainability and impact insights into decision making, engaging with a broad range of stakeholders to get your mission out there further, using impact reports to improve communication and engage with audiences in different ways, proving the work that you're already doing, and engaging different audiences. So, the core of today was really moving from insight to action and recognizing that there are many credible and flexible paths for organizations to take based on where they are today. Before we close, I did want to share that with this community, that in the spirit of Earth Day, although it was yesterday, for the first 5 organizations that reach out, we're offering 50% off our ESG Quick Start Assessment. It's basically a short, practical engagement designed to help clarify some of the priorities, understand where sustainability and impact intersect with risk and strategy, and identify realistic next steps. You'll see a link to that in the follow-up email after today's session. No pressure. Simply wanted to throw it out there as an option for those who found today's conversation helpful and wanted some more structured support as they think about what comes next. So thank you again for spending part of your day with us and for the important work you're doing in the organizations that you're all working with. We hope you leave with ideas you can take forward, confidence that this work can be manageable, and reassurance that you're not navigating it alone. Thank you all, and a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.